Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to review the Anbernic RG40XXV, and honestly at first glance there's nothing special about this handheld. It's running the exact same chip that we've seen in all the other devices with the XX name from Anbernic over the past year or so. Even the form factor is not unique, because Anbernic themselves have released 2 other vertical handhelds with the same chip. However, there are 3 things about this device that I think are really great. The first is that it has a 4-inch display which looks really impressive with its tiny little bezels, and they've also remade the shell to make it thinner and more conventional feeling. In fact, it's very similar to an Analogue Pocket. And then finally, they have perfectly tuned these controls, especially the D-pad. It's one of the best that they've ever made. And so I think this video is going to be relatively complex, just like how life is. And that's because when you really take a look at something, it can be many things at once. And in the case of the RG40XX, there are many reasons why you wouldn't want to pick it up, especially if you already own a device with the same chipset. But it also doesn't change the fact that it's one of the best devices that Anbernic has released, and I'm having a ton of fun trying it out. As you can imagine, we've got a lot of ground to cover here, and so grab a snack and drink and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, as always, let's get started with the specs. Like with all the other handhelds under the XX umbrella, this one is using the all-winner H700 chip. And this chipset has 4 ARM Cortex A53 cores. It also has a Mali G31 internal GPU as well as 1 GB of LPDDR4 RAM. We've got a 4-inch OCA laminated LCD display with a resolution of 640 by 480 and an aspect ratio of 4:3. And the battery is 3200 mAh, which is pretty standard for these devices. This is going to give you somewhere between 6 and 8 hours of gameplay depending on what you're playing. And if you play more of the lightweight retro systems, you can get upwards of 10 hours. It's pretty crazy. In terms of connectivity, we've got 5 GHz Wi-Fi as well as Bluetooth 4.2. And depending on the operating system you're using, you'll be able to use it with Bluetooth controllers and sometimes with Bluetooth headphones as well. And finally, the device does have a mini HDMI port. That means you'll be able to plug it into a TV if you want to play it on a bigger screen. We'll test that in this video as well. Now, in terms of pricing, this is an early review unit, and so the website is not up just yet, but it should be up in the next couple days. And I've been told that the price is going to be $67 plus shipping when it first releases, but they'll have some sort of coupon code for the first few days that will drop it down to around $60. However, one thing to keep in mind is that several months after these devices release, the prices will drop a bunch, usually by around $20. And so I would expect this to be around the $50 to $60 price point in the next couple months. So for example, if you're watching this video and it's been a couple months, it'll probably be a lot cheaper by then, especially near the holidays. So let's get started with an unboxing. And in full disclosure here, Anbernic sent me this device for review along with another one, and all opinions are my own. They're not seeing this ahead of time and no money was exchanged in any way. Looking at the box, it's exactly as you would expect, and you can see there are 3 different color options that they have available. They've got transparent black, indigo blue, and then we'll be checking out the white one right now. One interesting note is they put in some wet wipes, usually accompanied with a screen protector, but there's no screen protector in this one. We've also got a quick instruction manual. This will talk you through, some of the diagrams as well as hotkeys. And it also comes with a USB-C to USB-A charging cable, and like with other Anbernic devices, it's going to be pretty finicky when it comes to charging. In general, I just recommend using the cable that comes with it and with a low-powered charger. Now let's take a look at the device itself, and I've been pretty excited about this one. I've been seeing some of the marketing materials and I thought that the white one would look really nice, and sure enough, it really does. I really like the clean look of the white color as well as the white buttons. It reminds me a lot of an Analogue Pocket, as you can see here. I would say that the Analogue Pocket is a little bit cleaner looking just because it doesn't have that analog stick right here, and it doesn't have a speaker grill either, and so this one is a lot simpler looking and really clean. But I also really like the large screen on the Anbernic. I think it's very impressive. Now, first thing to note is the texture of the plastic. This is actually really high quality. It has a little bit of a gritty texture to it, but is still relatively smooth. And the plastic feels the same on the blue one, maybe a little bit more powdery on this one. I think they both feel very good. I would expect that the transparent black model will probably have a little bit more gritty texture to it. That's just kind of how it goes with Anbernic. Now, the second impression I had with this device is that it feels quite thin compared to what I was expecting with a large device like this, especially the other 4-inch handheld that they've made that's a vertical orientation, the RG40XXV. So let's take a look at the thickness of this device at its thickest point compared to other devices that are similar to it. So at its thickest point, it's a little bit less than 25 millimeters. And that's about the same thickness of the RG35XX Plus. You can see this one is also a little bit under 25 millimeters. So even though it is larger than this one, it's still about the same thickness. And that makes it about 2 millimeters thinner than the RG351V, which came out a couple years ago. And it's about 5 millimeters thinner than the RG405V. This is the big thick one that I was mentioning earlier. And it's about 8 millimeters thinner than the Game Boy DMG. Now, one device that's thinner than the one we're reviewing today is the MIUI Mini Plus. This one's about 2 millimeters thinner. And same thing with the Analogue Pocket, this one is about 2 millimeters thinner as well. So when it comes down to it, this is one of my favorite things about this device so far, is that it is relatively thin. I wish that it was completely flush, like it would lay down flat. It unfortunately does not, but I do still like the fact that it doesn't protrude too much. If we compare this against another vertical handheld that came out this year, this is the Powkiddy RG40XXV, you can see just how much these protrude. So I really don't like it on this handheld, but I think it's acceptable on this one. And I think in terms of pocketability, it is still pretty good, all things considered. It's definitely not something you would want to use with, smaller pockets like with jeans, but if you've got larger pants or shorts like me, I think this will actually work out pretty well. Personally, I wouldn't really consider this to be a handheld that I would put in my pocket and then walk around with. Instead, I would just more consider it to be a very comfortable, portable style handheld. And so right off the bat, I'm a fan of this overall shell and design. I like the feel of the plastic here. I love the really white, clean look to it. And then I also think that the overall ergonomics and just the shape of it and how thin it is really nice. It feels like they've been refining the design of their vertical handhelds, and I think this might be the best of the bunch at this point. Let's start with the controls, and we'll do the D-pad first. Now, this is a rubber membrane connection, very similar to other Anbernic devices, so really no surprises when it comes to the overall design. It feels and looks a lot like others that we've seen before. The amount of travel and pivot here is just about perfect. It reminds me more of a Nintendo-style controller, something like a Super Nintendo controller. As always, let's do a couple tests. We'll start with the contra test. So here I'm going to press down on the D-pad and then rock it left and right. And this is just about perfect for me. If I just wiggle it a little bit, you can see that the character barely moves, but then if I really try to push it, I can move the character as well. And so to me, this is a perfect middle ground in that if I am going to press down, it's going to work out fine, but if I want to press a diagonal, I can do that as well. And so really when it comes to rubber membrane devices, this is ideal for me, that I can have the best of both worlds. Next, let's try the other end of the spectrum by testing out a Street Fighter fighting game. And here I want to check how easy it is to press a diagonal when I want to. And given the fact that the contra test did so well, I'm not surprised that Street Fighter 3 Third Strike is doing really well too. I am missing a couple inputs, but that's totally a skill issue. I would say that I can throw my fireballs, dragon punches, as well as hurricane kicks, no problem. So this is a D-pad that both passes the contra test as well as the Street Fighter 3 test. And so yes, it is absolutely Hadoukenable and Shoryukenable. In fact, as far as rubber membrane D-pads go, I think that these two are the best that I've seen from Anbernic, the RG35XX Plus, as well as now the RG40XXV. Now, of course, the whole D-pad thing is very subjective, and so some people might have different preferences than mine, but at least for my own taste, this is knocking it out of the park. Of note, in terms of design, both the D-pad and the face buttons have this little circle around it. I think that actually looks pretty nice. Okay, next up, let's talk about this analog stick, and unfortunately, this is exactly like all of the others that we've seen from Anbernic on these cheaper devices. And so it is a Nintendo Switch-style Joy-Con that has just a tiny bit of movement here. It feels more like it flops over as opposed to actually giving you a full range of motion. It also feels pretty stiff as well, and so I've always found this range to be pretty limited, and I've never been a big fan of them. I'm really hoping that Anbernic has already put in an order for new types of analog sticks, and we're just waiting for the order to come in and for it to be implemented in other handhelds. A great example are the analog sticks on this little micro device that I reviewed just a few days ago. This is the XU Mini M. And even though this is like a $40 handheld, these sticks are way better. They are Hall effect sensors, and they have a full range of motion even though they are relatively small. And one point of clarification that I figured out after making that last video, you can remove these sticks. They're just really snug on there. And so you can see here, I put a 3D printed replacement. This one gives the stick a little bit more height, which just feels a lot better to me. So in the end, I'm not sure who's making these sticks. They're available on Retroid devices and AYN devices, and now we have it on the Mini M. And so I'm hoping that Anbernic can follow suit and put in an order for these as well, because I think that these should be the standard when it comes to small sticks in the future. Of note, these sticks do have RGB lighting when using the stock operating system. And within the settings, you do have some options that you can change. For example, you can change out the type of color or the pattern, and you can also change out the brightness and the speed of it as well. So if you do like having RGB on your stick, totally cool, but you can also just turn this off if you'd like to. And so when it comes down to it, I think these sticks are the worst thing on this device by far. Everything else is actually pretty great, as we'll show throughout the rest of this video, but these sticks really feel like it's holding the whole device back. And I feel like it's been that way for the past 10 Anbernic devices, so I really do hope that they are working on some sort of solution or upgrade. Now, as far as actual performance, this is exactly what I was expecting. This has a lot of cardinal snapping, so you can see that on the corners as well as on the east, west, north, and south directions, that's where the stick is mostly going to provide its input. What this means is that the stick itself feels more like an 8-way joystick like you would find on an arcade machine, as opposed to a true analog input. So this is going to be just fine when it comes to arcade games, but if you're playing something like Super Mario 64, you will definitely feel that lack of analog input. Now, thankfully, the community has been working on fixes for that. A lot of that is thanks to a developer named the Gamma Squeeze. So he's been working on a fix that we're hoping to have implemented in a lot of the custom firmwares available for these types of devices. But we are reviewing the device as it stands today as opposed to future prospects. And so right now, as it stands, yeah, we have 8-way inputs here and very little in terms of analog input. Okay, let's move on and talk about the face buttons. So these have a glossy texture to them. You can see they are also printed with the AB and XY pattern, and they are a rubber membrane connection. So exactly what we would expect from Anbernic. And yeah, they feel like an Anbernic button. They're a little bit tight, and the rubber membranes are quite firm, but usually these will break in over time. Let's take a look at the rest of the front. So we have an M or a function button right here. You'll use this as your hotkey. And then finally below that, we have our select and start buttons, and all of these are also rubber membrane, and they feel really nice. And then finally, we have a single mono speaker. Let's do a quick audio test. So overall, I would say the audio here is pretty good. It doesn't get quite as loud as I was expecting, but I still think it is plenty loud for most environments. And I think that the audio here is about what I would expect in that it lacks bass, but overall is relatively clear. So now let's take a look at these shoulder and trigger buttons. And first impression here, they've put a lot of angle onto the slope here. And I think it's pretty comfortable. It allows me to set my index finger right here, and it just is a very comfortable position when holding it. And so I like the fact that it does round up. Another thing I like is that even though these are relatively flush with the case, it's still enough space for me to rest my finger on there comfortably. It's not going to cover the entire finger, but it is enough. Now the buttons themselves have a little bit of a clicky sound to them, but they're not too bad. Let me give you a quick audio test. So overall, I think these buttons are fine. They're easy to press down on, although a little bit on the loud side compared to the rest of the buttons, but still not like super clicky and loud compared to others. Also on the back, we've got a sticker with the name of the model, as well as the battery size and then some charging parameters. And I think this would have been a cleaner design if they had used a white sticker with some darker text, as opposed to just a really big gray sticker here. Thankfully, there are Etsy shops like Sakura Retro Modding. I'll leave a link to them down below. They make stickers for devices like this, and they'll probably make like a holographic one or one based on your favorite game. And so this will probably get improved in the future by a third party. Also on the back, we've got a couple ridged bumps right here. This is very similar to what we've seen with other Anbernic devices before. It's not going to like fit your fingers perfectly or anything, but it is nice to have a texture like this on the back. Personally, I like the more subdued lines that you can get on an Analogue Pocket. I think this just feels a little bit more premium. Another device that does this well is the Magic X XU10. This one also has just, these kind of ribs on it instead, and I think these feel better. And then finally, a shout out to the MinUI Mini Plus because it has that same texture too. I really like this over something like the Anbernic device that has just those 3 little lines. So overall, I like that they did this in the first place, but I think it could have been improved upon. Next, let's take a look at the I/O. We'll start with the left side. So we have volume up and down, and then we have our first micro SD card slot. And mine came with a 64GB Kioxia card. And these cards are actually from a sub-brand of Toshiba, so they're pretty high quality, and I appreciate that they've upgraded these over the years. And this card will come preloaded with a bunch of games as well as their stock operating system, which we will check out here in a moment. On the right side, we have our second micro SD card slot. This is an expansion slot for additional ROM storage, and then we have our power and reset buttons here. And then finally up top, we have a micro HDMI port for video out, and then we've got 2 LEDs that'll indicate things like charging or whether or not the device is turned on. And then finally on the bottom, we've got a USB-C port. This can be used for charging as well as data, and then we also have a headphone jack. And really, that's about it when it comes to the overall controls and design language of the RG40XXV. I think they did a really good job here, and you can see that it's an incremental upgrade over their previous devices. For the most part, I would say that a lot of this is ideal other than this analog stick. I think this is still the weak spot on this handheld. I know there's a lot of people out there who would rather just not have this in the first place and have it just a very D-pad centric device. Personally, I'm in the camp that I actually find utility with an analog stick. Besides analog stick-centric consoles like Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast, I also like to use a stick with arcade titles and even some racing games. I also tend to use these sticks with games that require a full range of motion, something like Legend of Zelda. Even though it was originally made for a D-pad, I like the fact that I have a little bit more control with an analog stick, so I prefer to use it here. The nice thing is that the analog stick gets completely out of your way, so if you are playing something a little bit more D-pad centric, you won't even touch the analog stick, so it's great. So this is almost the best of both worlds. You can forget that it's even there when playing a D-pad centric game, but you can use it when you need it as well. Okay, next let's do a comparison against other devices of a similar size. On the far left, we have the RG40XXV. So this is an Android-based handheld, but it has a 4-inch screen. In general, I would say this is a functional handheld, but it is quite ugly. Yeah, it's kind of comfortable because it has these big grips here on the back, but this is not a device that I have found myself reaching for any time after making the review of it. Next on the line, we have the other wood boy. This one is the RG351V, and this was the first full-size vertical handheld that Anbernic released. This one has a 3.5-inch display, but a very similar design altogether. But you can also see how far Anbernic has come in terms of just reducing bezels between this one and the one we're reviewing today. Not only was there quite a lot of shell right here between the screen, but the bezels themselves were large, and we had that big Anbernic logo here. So I think we have come a long way over the past few years of Anbernic making these devices. Not only that, the shoulder buttons were a lot less comfortable and they protruded a lot more too, and so I like that they've improved this design as well. Now to the far right, we have the Powkity RGB20SX. The big thing that separates this one from the 40XXV is that it has a square aspect ratio, and this one is also a 4-inch screen. This means in order to play games like Super Nintendo, it's better to play it at an 8:7 aspect ratio so you can fill up more of this squarish screen. It is going to change the overall look and feel of the game depending on whether or not you're team 4:3 or 8:7, but I think they still both look very good. The big issue with this one is that it's just really tall because of that square screen, and honestly the controls are not great on this one, especially these back triggers. These just feel like a step down compared to the other. And then finally, to the right of the RG40XXV, we have the Analogue Pocket. This one has a 10:9 aspect ratio, so that's going to fit Game Boy and Game Boy Color. However, you can still play Super Nintendo games at 8:7 aspect ratio, and the black bars at the top and bottom are very minimal. This one definitely has a higher resolution display, and it's also an FPGA, so that means that it's going to be a lot more accurate. But the difference in screen size between these two is quite drastic. You can see that the 4-inch 4:3 display is just a lot bigger than the Analogue Pocket. So overall, between all these devices, if we're talking about the combination of having a nice screen to look at, as well as good controls, I think that the Anbernic actually wins out. Of course, there are other factors at play. For example, if you want to play higher end systems, this one is going to do the best because it can play all the way up to PSP no problem. And then of course the Analogue Pocket has the FPGA, so if you were looking for high accuracy, you can totally get that here. And here are a couple other size comparisons. On the far left, we have the Mio Mini Plus, then we have my original DMG Game Boy, and then to the right of the 40XXV, we have the FPGA GBC, and then finally on the far right, we have the Anbernic 35XX Plus. These two have the exact same chipset and performance, but you can see the screen size is different. I also have different configurations between the two, that's why this one has bezels. This is the stock experience versus what I've set up with this one. Either way, you can see that, yeah, the 4-inch screen is a lot bigger, but it's going to make the device larger as well. I wouldn't mind taking this one around in my pocket, but this one is just a little bit too big in that regard. Okay, in terms of weight, we're looking at 217 grams, which does make it about 60 grams lighter than the Analogue Pocket. But it does make it the heaviest among the XX devices, including the 40XXH. This is their horizontal version with a 4-inch screen. And then it's also heavier than my favorite XX device, which is the SP clamshell. One thing of note, the blue color between the V and the H models is different. You can see that this one is a little bit more like of an indigo or purple color. The plastic texture is also different. This one has a grittier kind of feel to it, whereas this one is just kind of slick and overall more cheap feeling. Okay, next let's talk about this display. There are quite a few things I like about it. First is just the color accuracy, as well as just the richness and vibrance of this display. I think it looks really good. I also like that the bezels are very thin. It makes for a more immersive experience. It really pops when you're playing this device. I also love having a 4-inch display because it makes everything a lot bigger. Now, it's not going to be a big deal when it comes to like Super Nintendo, but once you get up there with, PlayStation 1, Nintendo 64, and Dreamcast, the text will get a little bit smaller, and so a 4-inch screen is going to be better in that regard. Now, in terms of overall brightness, this is the maximum brightness value right here. I think it works really well in a well-lit environment indoors, but it's not as great outdoors. You can definitely still play this in the shade. For example, if you're playing inside of a car with a roof over your head, but in direct sunlight, yeah, it's almost impossible to actually see. However, here is the very dimmest setting, and I found this to be not quite as dim as I would like. I tried playing this last night in the dark in bed, and yeah, I just found it to be too bright even in that environment. So in terms of just dynamic range, it's not the best. I wouldn't want to play this in complete darkness, but I think just in a regular use case, playing it indoors with the lights on, it'll be absolutely fine. It's just in those extreme cases where it's not the best. Next, I want to talk about the stock software experience, and really not a lot has changed here among all the other handheld devices that have been released by Anbernic under the XX line. So I am just going to kind of cruise through this because I have covered it extensively in previous videos. We've got two different ways that we can start up games. We have our game rooms, which will show us just a bunch of standalone emulators. I generally do not recommend playing games from this section. Instead, I recommend using the RA game section. This is going to play most of the games via RetroArch, and then those like PSP, those will actually launch from a standalone emulator as well. So this section in general will give you the most versatility in terms of the settings as well as the best performance. Now to choose a game, it's pretty easy. You just press the A button and then you can cycle through. And like I mentioned, there are a bunch that are already preloaded on this device. But it is worth noting that a lot of Nintendo IP are not loaded on these cards. So that'll include Pokemon games, Mario games, Legend of Zelda. Many of these will not be available. You'll have to load them up yourself. But thankfully that process is very easy. You just take this micro SD card, put it into your computer, and then drag and drop your ROM files. Next we have the App Center. This will give you things like an ebook reader, a music player, and then also the app section. And here we've got a lot of configuration things that we can do. For the most part, I would recommend not messing with any of these, but if you want to change out the bezels, this is where you would do it. By default, the games that don't run in 4x3 will have bezels on the left and right, and so this allows you to turn them off. However, one thing worth noting, if you're going to be playing this externally, like on a monitor, it is worth it to turn the bezels on. And that's because this will fix any of the scaling issues of playing 4x3 content on a 16:9 display. Essentially, they have bezels that will fill out the rest of the space and then give you the correct aspect ratio. So if you are looking to consoleize your device, I would recommend leaving the bezels on. Another app worth mentioning is the Quick Shutdown app. This will determine what happens when you tap on the power button. You can either have it go to sleep, or you can have it power off your device and do a quick save at the same time. Now, one thing of note with this device and some of the other more recent Anbernic releases of their stock firmware, they now have what they call a low power mode sleep. And with their older versions of the stock operating system, when you put it into sleep mode, you would lose about 4% battery per hour. Well, I did a quick test this morning with one of these devices with the stock firmware, so I turned on a Super Nintendo game, and then I put it in sleep mode and just left it for 2 hours. I came back, powered it back on, and I had only lost 1% battery over that 2-hour period. So there is definitely some improvement there with the sleep mode, to the point where I think it's actually worth using. We've also got a favorites menu, as well as a history if you want to go back and check any games quickly. You also have a search function, and then finally our settings. And there are a couple things here worth noting. Number one is you can change how long it takes before the screen goes to sleep on its own. And you can also adjust the brightness, although personally I just press the menu button and then up and down on the volume to change the brightness myself. This is also where you can change the LED settings on the RGB light. And also here under network settings, this is where you can change your Bluetooth settings as well as Wi-Fi. You've got a couple other settings changes right here as well, and really that's about it. At the end of the day, I think that the stock operating system is very functional. In fact, it's probably one of the better stock operating systems that are available on cheaper devices like this, and Anbernic has continued to release updates for it, which is really a great sign. And so if you are looking for just a plug and play experience where you can just play the games that are already on here or maybe add a few of your own, that's all going to work out of the box really well. However, one of my favorite things about this whole retro handheld thing is the ability to use custom software, things that are made by the community. And thankfully, because this chipset has been worked on so much over the past year or so, we have a lot of options, and some of them already work out of the box with this device. And a lot of it is thanks to this handheld, which is the RG40XXV. This one already has a 4-inch display, and so community developers have already been working on firmware for this one, and thankfully that firmware also works on this because the displays just seem to be identical. And so let me show you two quick examples. We'll start with MinUI. This one is a very bare bones interface. It's all text-based. You can navigate through, pick your game, and then just launch it. Now, I've made a lot of modifications to this one with my previous device, and so I've added things like Dreamcast and Final Burn Neo, but out of the box, MinUI will mostly focus on PS1 and below. Either way, I went into more detail about this in my 40XXH review, and so I'll leave that one linked down below if you want to learn more. Either way, it is great to see that this is available on day one, and so if you want a MinUI interface on your device, it's already available. Another operating system that works really well on this already is KNULLI. So this is a fork of Batocera. I've done some tweaking to it with the theme and whatnot, but as you can see here, yeah, it is working just great. So I can navigate through. It has an emulation station interface, which I love. It gives me things like video previews for certain games. And so I really love just this overall robust navigation experience. I think it's really great. And so for the most part, I've been using KNULLI with this device in my past couple days of testing. So long story short, even though this device is just now launching, we already have a bunch of software support. And I expect that other custom firmwares, things like MuOS, will also be available for this device eventually. And so even though I know a lot of people like to complain about the fact that they keep using the same chipset on all these Anbernic devices, it's actually of a net benefit for most users because all the software work that's been done on other devices can be applied to these devices as well. And so personally, I like to think of it like we're getting more and more choice in that there are more and more form factors available with the same performance that we can expect. Speaking of which, let's move into performance, and I'm going to do this a little bit differently because I have tested, I don't know, a half dozen of these devices with the exact same chipset at this point. So let me just give you a quick summary and we'll focus on some other things that are going to be a little bit interesting in the rest of this video. So this will be able to play up to PlayStation 1 with absolutely no problem. There might be a couple trouble games here or there that just don't emulate well in this chipset or with the drivers, but for the most part, if it can play up to PS1, it's going to play just fine on this device. And even though this handheld was released later on in the whole life cycle of everything, Nintendo DS still plays really well because it's a pretty lightweight system. So in general, I would put this on par with PlayStation 1 as well. Now, another system that works really well on this device is Pico 8 because we can run the native app here on KNULLI. This means if I'm connected to the internet, I can boot up Explore. This will allow me to navigate through and actually download and update my games directly on here. And I featured this in a bunch of other videos as well, but I think it's pretty awesome that we can just navigate through, start up whatever game we would like just right here on the device. And there are thousands of little Pico 8 games that we can play on this machine, and so it really opens up the whole world if you want to play these types of games. Now when you get into Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast, it's going to be more hit and miss. Most of these games will run relatively well, but you'll have to use things like frame skipping and other hacks just to make sure that they run okay. So it's not a perfect emulation experience, but for the most part, I enjoy playing Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast games on these devices. I'm just a little bit more picky about which games run well, and thankfully some of my favorites do. Now PlayStation Portable can also play on this, but with diminishing returns. So here I would say maybe half the catalog can play okay, and again you'll have to rely on things like frame skip and other hacks. However, it is worth noting that a 4-inch screen still looks pretty good with 16:9 content like PSP. So I do think this screen is big enough to be able to play some PSP games comfortably. Now, one of the best benefits of using this chip is that we have a lot of port support. These are going to be PC ports that run natively on this machine. I did a whole video about Portmaster and how it works really well on these devices, and if you use a custom firmware like KNULLI right here, yeah, you'll have a lot of options here to be able to play some port games. And so if you are looking to play some of your favorite PC ports on this machine, they're going to work really well here. One port that was just recently released is Classic Cube. This is basically a Minecraft port. Now it's a little bit awkward with this device because we only have one analog stick. So here I've made the move buttons be the left analog stick and then my movement the D-pad. And so it's kind of like a dual stick game, but you're playing it on the left side only. Either way, if you were really trying to play Minecraft on one of these devices, it's a lot more possible than it was previously. Personally, I think you're better off playing more traditional ports, things like Stardew Valley, which is also really great on this little handheld. And so performance-wise, that's about what you can expect from these devices. You can get up to PS1 and Nintendo DS. Basically, all those games are going to play great, and then the other ones are going to have diminishing returns. So instead of focusing on performance for the rest of this video, I want to focus on some of the things that I've been doing with this screen over the past couple days to really optimize the experience and just show how great it can actually be. Now, for a lot of this, we're going to use shaders and overlays and integer scaling, and these things you might not be very aware of. However, I am working on a video that's going to be all about shaders and overlays and how to get the best image possible on a 480p 4x3 display like this one. So this isn't going to be a tutorial per se, but I am going to show off some of the results of my testing to get you a little bit excited about what you can do on a device like this. And bear in mind that all of these things that I'm going to show off in this video will apply to other devices like the SP, so it's not exclusive to this one handheld, but it's a great opportunity to show it off. So let's start with Game Boy and work our way up. So here I'm using what they call a perfect overlay, and I've shown this off in other videos before. This originally was made for MuOS, but you can easily integrate it into KNULLI, and so that's what I've done here. And we've got a couple things going on here. First is an overlay, which gives us these bezels on the left and right, and the overlay itself also provides an LCD grid on top of the image too. I'm also using some colorization to give it a more DMG look and feel to it. It's not perfect, it's more like a remastered version. And then finally, underneath all of that, I'm using a pixelate shader, and that's going to round out some of these pixels to make it look more balanced. And so even though this is not like integer scaled in perfect pixels, I still think it's pretty close. Another thing I like about this shader is it provides a little bit of shadowing around the edges, so it makes it look a little bit 3D, and so I like that too. Now, Game Boy Color is almost identical in the entire experience. I'm using the perfect overlay again, same shader and everything else. So these two are going to be very similar in just the overall look and feel, and I think it's awesome. Now for Game Boy Advance, it's also very similar. We are using an overlay here and the pixelate shader underneath, and I think this also looks really good. It's not going to be integer scaled, but honestly, I can't tell the difference once I have this set up, and I just love the very immersive feeling of having the Game Boy Advance logo on the bottom, and then just the little 3D effect of having that shadow within the overlay as well. Now when it comes to 8-bit and 16-bit systems, I think we have quite a few options. To start, I am balancing out the pixels again with that pixelate shader, and then I'm also using a CRT overlay, again borrowed from MuOS. And so it feels like this is the best of both worlds. We have really balanced pixels, but then also a light blooming that just feels a little bit like a CRT television. And so this is how I've been playing NES games, but you could apply this to Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, stuff like that as well. However, there are other things that we can do with those systems too, so let's test out those next. Now for Super Nintendo, I went a different route. This time around, I'm using integer scaling. This does mean the image is going to be smaller. If I turn off integer scaling, you can see it does fill out more of the screen. However, at that point, you're going to have unbalanced pixels, which means that you're going to have to use tricks like shaders and overlays like I did with NES. When we have integer scaling on, that means that we can apply some shaders that aren't going to work with it off. And so in this example, we're using one called CRT-1 tap, and this will only work with integer scaling on. But I would say the results here are fantastic. In addition to having nice perfect pixels, we also have a CRT scanline overlay, which just looks really nice. And so as long as you don't mind having a bit smaller of a screen, this can be a really optimal experience. And because we're working with a 4-inch screen, I don't really mind losing a bit of screen real estate. This is still going to be a better experience than trying to play these games on a 3.5-inch display. So I've got the same setup with the Sega Genesis. So I've got integer scaling and that CRT shader, and I think this combination works out really well. Now, once you get into systems like Sega Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, and PS1, you're not really going to need to use any of those shaders or overlays unless you want to. And that's because these will scale up perfectly to a 480p display. And so everything is going to be scaled great here. You really only are going to add those effects if you want to. And personally, I like to play them clean. And so I think this combination works out really well. When you're playing the retro systems, you can use shaders and overlays to kind of compensate for everything. And then, of course, the higher end content is going to scale perfectly. So you don't really have to worry about that. And so really, when it comes down to it, from a visual perspective, I think that this screen can work out great as long as you put in a little bit of work to make sure that everything is good. And like I said, I'm working on a shaders and overlay video, which I think is going to be very helpful for a lot of people. Okay, so that's really it when it comes to the showcase of gameplay performance, as well as the other shaders and stuff that I've been using. So let's move on and start talking about the summary, what I like and what I don't like about this device. As always, we'll start with what I like. And I think number one here, the big separating factor is this nice big screen. If you are looking for a 4-inch display device and you want something with a vertical orientation, I think that this is your best bet as long as you plan on focusing on retro games. Now, you could always go out and get the other 4-inch vertical handheld that they made, which is the 405V, but this thing is quite bulky, and then also this is probably more handheld than you may need because it's going to be between $125 and $150, and yeah, it can play like every Dreamcast, Nintendo 64, and PSP game, but you're going to pay for that premium. Meanwhile, the RG40XXV has been priced right. It's around $60 to $75, and if you're only focusing on retro systems, this is probably all the handheld that you may need. Now, going back to the screen, another thing I really like about this model in particular is that it has these nice thin bezels. In fact, these bezels are so thin that it makes me not mind using integer scaling. That means the bezels are going to be bigger, but really it's making them normal sized. And so it gives me more room to work with when it comes to configuration options, and I always love that. One other thing that makes this device stand apart from the other XX line of devices is that it doesn't really have any ambient heat as you play it. And the number one reason why this device runs so cool is because the CPU is away from your hands. It's behind the screen. And so even though, yes, it is warming up, you're not really going to feel that. And I think that's pretty awesome. On other handhelds like this one, the 40XXH, it's super thin. And so the heat gets distributed right to your hands because the CPU is right here. And so if you're like me and you don't like getting that warm feeling in your hands as you're playing one of these cheap handhelds, this one is not going to have that issue. I also love the fact that because we're using a tried and true chipset, we know exactly what kind of performance we're going to get. And then as a secondary benefit of that, because it's using the same chipset, that means that custom firmware like KNULLI is going to work out of the box. And so I love the fact that the RG40XXV stands on the shoulders of other handhelds that have released previously. It gives you a very best of experience, even though this is a brand new model. Now, of course, as expected, there are a couple things that I don't like about this device, but to be honest, this list is very short. The number one thing here is the same issue I've had with other handhelds, and that's the analog stick. Not only does it not feel very good to use from a hardware perspective, the programming of the software itself doesn't seem to be accurate either. And so it works more as an 8-way joystick as opposed to a true analog input. And honestly, the only other thing that I can think of as a negative is just that there's a very crowded market right now. If you're a subscriber of this channel, chances are you may have already bought one of these devices, and for good reason. Anbernic has already released quite a few under the XX line that are really great handhelds. My personal favorite is the clamshell model because it's so portable and just really easy to use, and I love that lid function. And so this last one really isn't a dig at the device itself, other than the fact that we just have so many other options, and this one in particular might not be the best fit for you. Now, to put this into perspective, I think we should actually compare this against the Analogue Pocket. I know that's blasphemy to talk about hardware emulation with an FPGA versus software emulation, but I think it is a conversation worth having. And that's because the device I was reminded of the most when playing with the RG40XXV was the Analogue Pocket itself. And honestly, I found so many ways where the overall user experience was just better on the Anbernic compared to the Analogue. To start, we've just got this wonderful user interface with custom firmwares like KNULLI, which allows us to customize everything, including, just the theme as well as theme options. In addition, the RG40XXV can play a lot of systems the Analogue Pocket cannot, including things like PlayStation as well as Dreamcast. Now, to be fair, the Analogue Pocket is a lot more accurate, and it's also more expensive being an FPGA. It's going to be about $300 after shipping and all that. And so it is close to 4 times the price of the 40XXV once shipping and all that is done. And personally, I don't see myself getting 4 times the enjoyment with the Analogue Pocket. In fact, I get more enjoyment from the 40XXV. Software emulation has a bunch of benefits to it, including things like save states and shaders and overlays, as well as rewind, fast forward, and cheats. And so the more that I kept playing with the RG40XXV, I kept thinking to myself, man, this is almost like a pinnacle vertical handheld. And again, it really comes down to whether or not this form factor works out for you and whether or not you're in the market to get a device with this chipset. Either way, I think my big takeaway here is the fact that I'm comparing it to the Analogue Pocket at all says a lot about the Anbernic device. And it all really goes back to the intro of this video, where I said that life is complex and things can be one thing as well as another. And in the case of the RG40XXV, this is an amazing device that you may not need because you might have something similar already. And so we are left in a bit of conundrum. If this is your very first handheld and you want something that's vertically oriented, then this is absolutely a no-brainer. I can totally recommend it. However, if you already have something very similar and you're not really into vertical handhelds, then this one is definitely worth skipping. And so it is a bit complex because this is an easy to recommend device that can also be very hard to recommend as well. But I hope that throughout this video I've given you enough information to make that decision yourself. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you going to pick up one of these, or do you have something similar already? Or are you waiting for the inevitable next release from Anbernic? Because next month they'll have something as well. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.